Hi, I'm Faye.
And I'm Tracey, and welcome to More Better with Tracey and Faye. Today, Faye, the topic of performative communication has been on my mind the last couple weeks. And I wanted to talk about it because it struck me about the difference. Do people really understand the difference between performative communications and authentic communications? Because, and I guess this is me saying, I don't believe that performative communications are authentic, but they're everywhere around us. And so I wanted to talk about that with you today. Do you have an opinion? I hope so.
I have an opinion. We have lots of opinions here.
Because when we can spot the difference between performative and authentic communication, then we're better informed. Well, we can still respond to it, but understand that we're responding to something that is performative, not authentic. And if we can understand it in what we are reading and seeing and hearing in the world, then we can start to spot it in ourselves. And I will tell you what the jumping off point was for this.
Okay, go for it.
This is not a political podcast, but the jumping off point was that apparently in the recent trial of Donald Trump, Hope Hicks, who used to be his head of communications, and she was close to him, it came up about communication and how the former president communicated. And what Hope Hicks said was that they always took their lead from Trump because Trump was absolutely the best person to communicate his message. So whatever he would do, they would follow. And I was thinking about that, going, does that make him a good communicator? And I would say, based on what I think a good communicator is, he is not that. But is he effective at what he wants to do and what he wants to get done and the reaction he wants to see from his audience? Well, yes, he is. No doubt about it. His audience absolutely responds to him. But does that make his communications authentic or performative? And I think it still makes it performative for the audience he wants. And I get that, but it doesn't make it authentic. And that's the conversation I wanted to have today is, what is performative? What is authentic? And how do we spot the difference? And how do we decide what we want to do in the communication space, right? Sometimes we want to be performative, and that's not always a bad thing, but it is what it is, but it's not authentic. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think that makes sense. What's coming up for me is that I don't think, maybe, are we talking about, we're not saying is performative bad or good. Like, I don't think it's about good or evil or good or bad. Do you know what I mean? Like, it's more about, like you say, performative communication has a place, perhaps. Maybe it's a limited place.
Yep.
We can talk about that.
That sounded like I was maybe having an accident, but I was pouring coffee. My apologies.
4 minutes. Okay, but like, I lost my train of thought. But authentic communication, I think, always has a purpose. Perhaps, maybe that's how about that as a conversation today?
Yeah. Okay. So another thing I'm going to share. Like, I want to get into what are the characteristics of performative communication. And to do that, I want to tell a little short story.
Okay.
Not related to any politician anybody knows. But this was my first big job in a company that no longer exists. It was called Home Oil in Calgary. And the president and CEO, his name was Dick Cascane. He was called Dick, so just so you know. And he wasn't. He was a lovely, lovely human being. And when I first joined the company, people always talked about, oh, Dick, he's the greatest communicator. People in the company loved him because he was such a great communicator. And my office, being in communications, was up on the executive level because that's what happens. And I had a friend of mine who would visit me at the office all the time. He'd come up and we'd meet, we'd go for lunch. And he came up on the elevator so often that he would see Dick Cascane all the time. And Dick started seeing him. And he would say to him, hey, how are things going down there? Because, of course, everybody was below the executive level in the office. And it made me laugh because Dick had no idea who he was. He just assumed he worked there. And so he
Aw.
said, "Hey, how's it going?" And I know people in the company would say, "Oh, Dick he just always knows who I am." I'm like, "Does
Aw.
he? Does he really?" And then when Dick left, he retired and a new person came in who did not have that kind of charisma, like
Sure.
even a little bit. He was a very low key kind of person and not a glad hander, not a charismatic man. But what I found out from talking to the people who actually worked around the table, the other executives from around the table, is that Dick Haskane was very authoritarian.
Interesting.
Whereas the guy who came in afterwards, who people would not say he's a great communicator, but with his team, he was very collaborative. So this notion of who is a great communicator and what does that actually mean is it makes it kind of up for grabs, because is the
Hmm.
best communicator the person who's the shiniest object?
Huh.
And that's the question. I mean, Donald Trump is a shiny object. Dick Haskane is a shiny object. It's hard to ignore someone who has that kind of charisma
It
and
is like
presence and wanting people to pay attention to them.
y- w- what's coming up for me too is, when you go into a meeting and there's always someone who's like the loudest person in the room, or
Yeah.
they're always talking, right? And I think sometimes we think that that's what good leadership looks like, or what good
Hmm.
communication looks like. But just because someone's talking, and it could be for different reasons, and I know we're going to jump into that in a minute, about characteristics, right?
Yeah.
But what's coming up for me is that we sometimes see someone like that and we go, oh, well, they're a leader, and that's what a good leader looks like. When in
Yeah.
fact, maybe it's all performative, right? Maybe they're
Yeah.
I'll call it like
Well,
chest bumping or chest thumping or whatever, right? Like it's like I need to come up at it because I need to look like this. It's all about optics. When
yeah.
really maybe the quiet person in the room actually has something more substantive to say.
Well, and that is an excellent lead in to the characteristics. Characteristics. How many syllables? How about I say traits?
Sure.
One syllable. The traits of performative communication. So, like you said, focuses more on style than on substance. It often involves something flashy or dramatic, or a dramatic delivery, buzzwords, jargon, complex language. I'm going to baffle them with all of these complex words. And like we just said, it relies on charisma or charm or manipulation, depending on how you want to describe it. And the goal is to gain applause, not understanding. I think that's a big one.
Ah, interesting. Yeah.
Performative communications is about getting applause, getting a spotlight, getting the attaboys, getting the hey, good for you, as opposed to the goal being other people having understanding. And yes, I think you said this too. It's very short term. It's very
Yeah.
short term thinking, and yet we love it, right?
Yeah, we do. I mean, all you have to do is look at social media, right?
Yeah.
Pick a platform, TikTok, Instagram, performative communication is alive and well, and it's being consumed as if it was authentic. Like I think of like
Yes.
wolf in sheep's clothing. Is that right? Wolf in sheep's clothing. So,
Yeah.
it amplifies, social media today amplifies performative communication. Think of it, short, evocative messages, right? Reels, shorts, clips. It rewards those messages that are long on image and short on substance, right? So
Yes.
they get amplified, they get lots of likes, they get lots of views, all that sort of good stuff. And what does that do? People go, oh, that's how I should communicate. It encourages people to
Yeah.
prioritize creating that kind of persona online.
Yeah.
It also, like I said, it validates that performative communication behavior by
Hmm.
reinforcing it. And the pressure, and I feel this pressure too. I mean, we do this in our, like when we promote our podcast, the pressure is to create something curated or polished. Or actually, what's interesting too is maybe it doesn't look like it's polished, but it is,
Yeah.
right? So, and that can lead to an inauthenticity, or a lack of sort of genuine connection. So
Hmm.
I know I'm
Yeah.
nerding out on that, but like I think that there's
Well, I
something
think
there. Like
about
it
it,
looks like it's packaged, or it looks like it's not packaged, but it really
but it
is.
is.
It
because
is.
that's part of my image, is that I'm unpolished. Well, I think it's at its most dangerous when we're talking about really complicated situations. Like
Mm.
pick a war. Pick a war, and then people pick a side, and then they use these performative communications, these catchy slogans, this
Mhm.
awful, one image, and and people, it doesn't matter what side you're on, that image becomes the symbol for everything. And yet any kind of geopolitical conflict is deeply complicated. It's really complex. It's probably it's got multiple avenues to it and a lot of history.
Yeah.
Right? Any geopolitical conflict does. But we dwell it, it just gets condensed into these performative statements and these performative images, and that don't serve the greater good of understanding. Okay, sorry. Off that soapbox. But one of the things
This
that
is
I
not a
thought,
political podcast.
this is
Not
not a political
political.
podcast. But I thought what we could do here is to simplify it by looking at the ways performative communications differs from what you and I think of as authentic communications, because they do differ in a lot of substantial ways. They differ in motivation, they differ in sincerity, they differ in empathy, they differ in transparency, and they differ when it comes to relationship dynamics.
Yeah.
So let's take those one at a time. So Faye, start us off.
Motivation. So how does authentic communication differ from performative communication?
Yeah.
So when you think of authentic communication, it's driven by genuine intentions, right? Building trust, fostering understanding, connecting with others on a deeper level.
Yeah.
Whereas performative communication is motivated or may be motivated by, as you said before, a desire for attention, validation, or approval. It's focused more on impressing or manipulating others for
Mhm.
personal gain.
Yeah. Yep. So sincerity, the second one. So in authentic communications, if I am communicating in a way that I thought was authentically, it would be consistent with my values, my beliefs, my emotions. It would reflect my genuine expression of thoughts and feelings. Whereas if I'm being performative, I may lack that sincerity or authenticity. I might come across as scripted. That
Mm.
happens a lot in, let's say, mea culpa interviews that, well-known people have to do, but they were caught doing bad stuff. And then they have to come out and they have to say, very, very sorry for what I did. I won't do it again. Please vote for me. And boy, you can the people get slammed if they don't come across as authentic. They are really
Yeah.
slammed for that. So, because it's, it sounds rehearsed, it sounds scripted, and it sounds, oftentimes exaggerated for effect.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No. Empathy, I would say, is another element. So authentic communication would include or involves active listening. So
Yeah.
really like actually shutting up, listening to somebody, right? Empathy, of course, and a genuine interest in understanding other people's perspectives and emotions. I would also add that authentic communication in the air, like when we talk about empathy,
Mhm.
um, requires a sense of vulnerability from
Yeah.
each other, right? Again, not just from one person, right? But it's be able to be vulnerable in that exchange, if you will. Performative communication would prioritize like speaking over listening. So sometimes you observe that in that meeting, right?
Mhm.
Like someone say, or what that person said, or you've said something and someone is saying the exact same thing because they didn't listen to you, they didn't hear you.
Right.
And the focus there, which we've seen, is a focus on self promotion or trying to control the conversation without considering the needs or feelings of others.
Hmm. Which leads us to transparency. And again, authentic communication is transparent and open. And it's like you talked about vulnerability. sharing thoughts, experiences, and emotions. Again, think of your favorite politician. Do they really share what they're feeling in any given moment? Or are they just saying what they believe needs to be said to get them through whatever that current situation is? Whereas performative, rather than being transparent and open, is hiding, masking vulnerabilities, projecting a facade of perfection or success. Boy, you see that a lot on social media. Go to LinkedIn. Let me tell you how successful I am.
What's interesting about I read a quote this morning from Simon Sinek. He wrote, start with why
So
and,
many
and all,
things.
so many things. So good, right?
Yeah.
And I saw a quote from him today about transparency and how transparency is not about saying everything. It's not about that. It's providing context and the right context and background so that someone can understand, whatever it is. And I thought that was a really interesting quote, because sometimes we think that word transparency means, well, I got to tell them everything. I don't know, like whatever that is. And it's like, it's not. It's about being, providing context for the situation at hand.
Yeah, that's great. I like that. That's really, really good. I like that that explanation for what we mean by transparency.
I thought that was kind of a cool way to sort of think about that.
Yeah.
That also leads us to relationship dynamics. So how does authentic communication look? What does it look like? And it builds trust. We talk about that so much in our podcasts. Rapport. So we talk about that connection and a mutual respect in relationships. It fosters those deep connections and meaningful interactions. We also talk about that a lot in our one of our earlier podcasts. We talk about hard things, right? So it's really being able to build that trust all the time. Whereas in performative communication, it can actually be a strain on relationships, right? It creates misunderstanding or confusion, right? You were talking earlier about using those big words or complex phrases. And it's like, what? Like we've all been in a situation where maybe we see a leader, maybe they're not, it's performative because they're using jargon things, and you're left with, it sounds good, but I actually don't know what that means. I've been in so many, I don't know. Yeah. Have you been in those situations, Tracey? Like, I don't know what that means, but I'm going to say it anyway.
Earlier in my career, just being younger than I am now, when people would say things that I didn't understand, if they were, say there was a bit of a power dynamic, I wouldn't say anything. I'd just be like, oh, I should understand that.
Yeah.
So I don't want to reveal my stupidity. So I'm just going to make a note and try and figure it out later. Whereas now, because I'm old and I don't have that insecurity anymore, I would just say, I don't actually know what that means. And what's interesting is when I've used that, and it hasn't been in a super power and balance situation, but I have been in situations where people say something and it sounds all important and whatever. And I'll say, well, what does that actually mean? And then it's interesting watching people backpedal a little bit when their big grandiose statement doesn't land. And then they actually need to think about why they said what they said and what they mean by it. Then it changes the conversation, right? And then it becomes a better conversation.
Yeah.
And the other thing that came up for me when you were just talking about relationships around performative communication is back to, Dick Cascade in the elevator, is he didn't actually know who my friend was. He just assumed he worked there. So he did the thing,
Sure.
Hi, how's it going down there?
Sure.
But what would happen if my friend in a totally different situation said, hey, Dick, how's it going? And he would be like, I don't know who you are.
Yeah. Hello,
right?
person.
Hello, person. And
Hello,
you'll see
buddy.
things like that. I think I've seen it in movies as well, right? Where there's this person, I love you all. You're all my friends. You matter so much to me. And then the character is like, well, thank you so much, Joanne, for saying that, because here are my needs. And Joanne, who we pick on all the time. We don't know Joanne, but poor Joanne. Is just like, oh, I don't know you. Please go away. And then you get busted, right? You're like, oh. So now mistrust reigns. And so I guess I'll give you the last word. as I stop blathering, but there's so much performative communication online and social media, and it's not always bad at all. We engage in it, we use it for those purposes, but it is, if you aren't understanding what it is or how you're responding to it, then you can find yourself um, less informed, at a disadvantage, making assumptions that actually aren't always true, not fully understanding a situation. Just like, I mean, the fact that people get rewarded and pats on the back for making the
Yep.
best insult in the internet is a bad world, I think. I'm not, the sick burn is not something to be rewarded, but somehow it is. Anyway, your
Yeah, it's
thoughts?
interesting how that's sort of turned. Hey,
Yeah.
I'm going to go back to a comment you made about calling out performative, like you see complex phrases or you'll hear that in a meeting or a presentation.
Hmm.
And where I find what's interesting is I work with a lot of people who have to create decks, and so there's a lot of jargon, or they'll take things from where maybe their leader or a leader has used a phrase. And so when we're going under review and I ask them, well, what do you mean by X?
Hmm.
And that's, I think, revealing, because they're like,
Yeah.
well, I actually mean it actually means this, this, and this. Like, I'll see that in a report. Like, what do you mean by, this, I don't know, observation or insight you're making? And they'll say, well, it actually means, and they'll say something completely different in real language, real
Yeah.
words. And I'll be like, that's what you should put in the report.
Say that.
Say that, put that in the deck. Right. So,
Yeah. This product is a game changer. Well, what do you mean by
what do you
that?
mean by that? Oh, it's because it, I don't know, it's faster, bigger, it's bright red, whatever that is. Great. Let's say that. Or better yet, it helps people do one, A, B,
Yeah.
and C. Oh, put that. And
Yeah.
so it's interesting because I think what happens is that whether it's in the workplace or, like you say, in social media or in your life or whatever, we observe or see things we think, like going back to your observation around shiny,
Hmm.
sparkly and shiny. We see that and we go, well, I want to be like that. And
Yeah.
I guess maybe my turn to ramble on, but one of the things is perhaps it doesn't always have to be shiny and sparkly. It just has to be real.
Just
And
has
I
to be
think
real. Yeah.
that's to me, that I think is much better than I'm not saying they're either or, but it could be both. But don't focus on being shiny and sparkly. Focus on being real first, and then we'll get there.
Yeah. If you want to, some people will be like, you know what, I'd rather be performative. Thank you very much.
Sure, sure.
But don't talk to us because we have no respect for that.
Exactly. Anyway, this was a great conversation. Thanks for bringing this up today. And with that, I'm Faye Furdyk.
And I'm Tracey Hirsch. Join us next time on More Better with Tracey and Faye.